Personal finance operates as a dynamic flow system. Income is a single, steady stream, branching rapidly into a complex network of smaller, fragile financial obligations. For a long time, Brian assumed his particular system was secure. He maintained a stable job, leased a comfortable apartment, and accumulated a modest pool of savings. But dynamic systems are vulnerable to exogenous shocks. These are unpredictable external stressors that introduce sudden, severe friction into an otherwise stable environment. In this node network, we can trace what happens when multiple exogenous shocks overlap. In a single month, Brian experienced a vehicle breakdown, a hardware failure, and sudden unemployment. 3 simultaneous stressors struck the system. His accumulated savings drained completely in 3 weeks. A baseline of reliable income and a small cash reserve create a false sense of security. If the underlying architecture cannot withstand overlapping external stressors, that financial stability is an illusion. In the immediate aftermath of this system collapse, Brian found himself relying on external borrowing, taking loans from friends simply to cover basic caloric intake. His sister, Amanda, had repeatedly offered a precise corrective thesis. You must engineer a buffer before the crisis occurs, not react as it unfolds. The initial setup failed because of a structural flaw known as the commingling of assets. Storing emergency reserves within the same operating capital used for daily expenses guarantees that those reserves will evaporate rapidly during a systemic stress event. The money is too close to the blast radius. A functional shock absorber requires 3 specific mechanical properties: a strictly defined volume, an isolated spatial location, and an automated input mechanism. Surviving a highly volatile economic environment requires architecting a dedicated financial defense system. You cannot rely on the mathematical improbability of endless good luck. Mapping the new architectural blueprint begins with establishing a quantitative target. Looking at this blank system canvas, we first install a new, entirely isolated reservoir. The exact volume required for systemic stability is rigid: 3 to 6 months of living expenses. Note the terminology. Living expenses represents the bare minimum capital required to sustain shelter, food, and utilities. It is not a replacement for baseline income, nor does it cover discretionary spending habits. The operational parameters for this capital are absolute. The money is excluded from vacation planning and consumer purchases. Labeling this money explicitly for catastrophic emergencies creates a psychological barrier. It forces the user to categorize the capital as untouchable under normal operating conditions. This target acts as a capital volume constraint. It is the exact mathematical threshold at which the individual can survive a prolonged employment gap without defaulting on core obligations. Without a rigidly defined volume target, an emergency fund is simply an ambiguous pool of savings. Ambiguous savings are highly prone to premature, unjustified depletion. Once the volume is defined, we have to determine the spatial arrangement of the system. Where exactly must this capital be housed? This flowchart illustrates the strict requirement for routing the fund. The capital must travel a separate, distinct pathway into an entirely isolated savings account, physically removed from the primary checking pipeline. Behavioral economics utilizes a concept known as friction barriers. Implementing physical and psychological separation protects the buffer. It prevents accidental, frictionless depletion during routine daily transactions. However, this necessary psychological friction competes against an opposing requirement. The capital must retain high liquidity to be deployed immediately during a verified crisis. This creates a structural paradox. The capital must be difficult to access casually, yet immediately accessible when the system is actually compromised. Structural segregation solves this. It's the only viable method to protect capital from the user's own daily spending habits while maintaining necessary disaster mitigation properties. Accumulating a 3 to 6 month volume target from zero requires sustained time and small, consistent initial inputs. Upon securing a new job, Brian established a deliberate input mechanic, allocating exactly $50 per pay cycle. To maintain this consistency, he utilized automated system routing. This mechanism replaces the need for manual daily human discipline. Notice in this diagram how the $50 payload is diverted automatically. It drops directly into the isolated savings reservoir before the user can perceive it as disposable income within their primary account. Human willpower is inherently flawed when executing long-term, unexciting financial planning. Automating the input permanently removes the highest probability point of failure, the user's memory and discipline. A truly resilient financial structure does not expect human behavioral perfection. It relies on cold, automated mechanics. Fast forward 2 full years. This visualization demonstrates a mature system. We can now evaluate how this newly architected foundation performs under unexpected duress. A new exogenous shock strikes the system. A severe storm causes immediate, highly localized structural damage to Brian's roof. Watch the fully built flowchart react. When the weather hazard strikes, the isolated savings node instantly deploys capital to neutralize the threat. The shock is entirely absorbed by the isolated buffer. The primary operating capital in the checking node remains untouched, functioning normally. A properly architected shock absorber does exactly what it is designed to do. It neutralizes massive, overlapping emergencies and reduces them to strictly logistical inconveniences. An emergency fund is an active defense mechanism. It is never an investment vehicle designed for yield. It functions correctly only when built upon 3 non-negotiable architectural pillars: a strictly defined mathematical volume, a segregated physical location, and fully automated inputs. Unpredictable life events will continually test your financial stability. Replacing that chaos with an engineered, rigid system is the only mathematically sound way to secure absolute peace of mind.